A Lufthansa Airbus, A320, was en route to Warsaw. Although they were advised that the approach was subject to severe wind shear, they elected to proceed. It was unknown to them that a weather front was approaching the aerodrome, which was anticipated to result in significant wind fluctuations. This convergence of complications resulted in an immense catastrophe. Please remain attentive to determine the cause and circumstances. Lufthansa Flight 2904 is the subject of this narrative. It was an Airbus A320 that was operating a flight from Frankfurt to Warsaw on September 14, 1993. The aircraft and crew had already made several trips from Frankfurt to Barcelona and returned to Frankfurt that day, and all of these trips were conducted without any complications. 2 pilots, 4 cabin personnel, and 64 passengers were present on this leg from Frankfurt to Warsaw. For the pilots, the commander of the A320 was situated in the left-hand seat. The Airbus A320 accounted for 1,440 of his 12,778 total flying hours, and he was 47 years old. He would serve as the pilot for the duration of this voyage and must undergo a test, as he had not flown in the previous 90 days. The instructor who would be conducting the test for the duration of this flight was also an A320 captain and sat in the right-hand seat. The individual in question was 47 years old and was not to be an active pilot. In total, they accumulated 11,361 hours of flight time and 1,595 hours of type time. Thus, the crews received all of their pre-flight documentation, which included weather information for Warsaw. They alighted from the aircraft with the passengers and subsequently began the startup taxi. Ultimately, they took off en route to Warsaw. The aircraft was airborne during the passage of a weather front through Warsaw, which is a noteworthy fact. It was anticipated that this would result in potential thunderstorms and a small amount of low cloud cover. However, the information they had received at the time of launch was still within the legal limits and permitted them to proceed. I will simply present the forecast that they received. It may appear to you as a jumble of letters and numbers, but I will swiftly review it to ensure that you comprehend its true meaning. Consequently, the initial component pertains to the time at which the forecast was received, positioning oneself to the right of the 17005 MPS. This represents the wind direction and velocity, which is 5 meters per second and emanates from 170 degrees. Visibility is indicated by the subsequent number, which is 4 nines. So, visibility is defined as 10 kilometers or greater. The cloud base is denoted by BKN 030, which translates to broken at 3,000 feet. In terms of fracture, this essentially means that an imaginary circle is present over the top of an aerodrome, and it is divided into 8 sectors. The cloud base will be classified as few, dispersed, broken, or overcast based on the extent to which those sectors are clouded. Therefore, the subsequent section refers to tempo, which denotes temporarily. Therefore, it is temporarily transitioning to 6,000 meters of visibility at 1521. SH and RA are abbreviations for precipitation and rain, which are interrupted at an elevation of 2,000 feet. Cumulonimbus clouds, which are typically associated with thunderstorms, are the subject of the CV at the conclusion. Subsequently, it indicates the correct number of 30. This is a reference to the fact that there is a 30% likelihood of the occurrence of thunderstorms, which is denoted as TS. Lastly, it refers to the process of becoming. Therefore, the visibility will range from 2,124 to 4,000 meters. RA denotes rain, followed by overcast conditions at an elevation of 1,500 feet. Therefore, there is a significant amount of information to absorb. However, the primary message is that the weather is quite pleasant at 1524. There is a possibility of a few thunderstorms, as the cloud base is expected to decrease, and there will be temporary showers and rain. Subsequently, the situation becomes slightly worse in the evening, as the cloud base decreases and visibility decreases. However, the primary reason for my bringing this matter to your attention, and the reason I believe it is significant in the context of this incident, is that the wind direction and speed are only mentioned once in this forecast. And this becomes particularly critical when the crew arrives in Warsaw. Therefore, at 1427 UTC, they departed Frankfurt for Warsaw. Then, they ascended to flat level 330 and continued to cruise as they approached Polish airspace. The meteorological information on the east side of Warsaw was then listened to as they drew closer to the city. Automatic Terminal Information System, or ATS for short. They achieve this by tuning the ATS frequency, which provides them with a computer-generated voice that provides them with the latest local meteorological information at the aerodrome. During this time, they were informed that the wind was now blowing at a velocity of 22 kilometers per hour and had reached a temperature of 150 degrees. The QNH was 997 hectopascals, and the clouds were at 2,000 meters, with a visibility of 10 kilometers. The incident is unaffected by the fact that the cloud base was specified in meters rather than feet, as you were informed. Consequently, the crew contacted air traffic control in Warsaw after listening to the ATS and informed them that they were prepared to descend. Then, they were authorized to descend to flight level 190. A few minutes later, Warsaw ATC instructed the crew to proceed directly to the VOR at Warsaw. The crew was instructed to contact Warsaw Approach at 128.8 when they reported they were at flight level 190, and after establishing communication with Approach, they were authorized to descend to flight level 50, and subsequently to descend to 950 meters on the QFE. During this period, the aircraft was passing an altitude of 3,300 feet, and the crew subsequently began to reduce the speed in order to achieve their landing speed of 130 knots. A few minutes later, Approach controlled and radioed that the preceding traffic had reported wind shear on final approach 11. The crew of Lufthansa 2904 discussed the procedures that must be implemented to mitigate wind shear during the approach after hearing this transmission. They then mutually determined that they would increase their landing speed by 20 knots in order to attain a speed of 150 knots at the threshold. At this juncture, they neglected to address the potential impact of this increased speed on their landing distance, and whether runway 11 had the necessary length to accommodate this increased speed. At this juncture, Approach Control contacted them and instructed Lufthansa 2904 to turn right 080 in order to lock onto the ILS 11 cleared approach. This was the second call made when the approach was established. They subsequently reported that they had been established on the ILS and were directed to continue the approach as number 1 and adjust the tower frequency to 126.6. The tower informed them to proceed in the ILS approach and call me in the outer marker wind 160 degrees to 5 kilometers after they had switched to the tower. Prior to landing, wind shear was reported on final runway 11. Then, Lufthansa 2904 responded with Roger, stating that it was understood that I refer to you as an outer marker. At this time, the aircraft was traveling at a ground speed of 180 knots and an indicated airspeed of 163 knots as it passed through 2,800 feet. The aircraft that had just landed before them spoke to the Warsaw Tower stating, Good evening. Jet Aviation 101. Runway 11 is vacated on taxi Echo Oscar. We experienced severe wind shear on final. The tower then contacted Lufthansa 2904 and informed them that they were clear to land on runway 11 with a wind speed of 160 degrees and a gust of 25 kilometers per hour. It is important to note that the front had reached Warsaw Aerodrome at this time, and variable wind conditions had arrived with it. It has been reported that the wind direction changed from 160 degrees to 270 degrees during their approach to land. At the time of landing, the wind was blowing at a speed of 10 meters per second from 220 degrees, with gusts of up to 15 meters per second. This transition from a headwind to a tailwind increased their ground speed as they approached the runway, approaching at an already rapid pace. By this time, the aircraft was at a height of 278 feet, with an indicated airspeed of 147 knots and a ground speed of 168 knots. The crosswind caused the aircraft to slightly rotate to the right as it was about to land, resulting in only the right landing gear making contact with the runway. The ground spoilers and engine reversers were not activated for 9 seconds as a result of the requirement that both wheels be on the ground, either rotating at a speed exceeding 72 knots or with weight on both landing gears. This indicated that the aircraft was now 1,525 meters into runway 11 and was continuing to travel at a speed of 154 knots. The pilot requested that the pilot in the right-hand seat assist with deceleration, as the aircraft was not slowing down. However, the ground spoiler and reverse thrusters were activated, but only to a maximum of 71%, and one on the engines after the left landing gear made contact with the runway and weight was applied. To exacerbate the situation, the runway was covered in a layer of water, which caused the rain to aquaplane, resulting in the wheel's brakes not functioning. Additionally, it was pouring heavily. The aircraft was beginning to decelerate, but it was not slowing down at a sufficient rate to ensure that it would halt in time for the runway's conclusion. The pilots then observed an embankment beyond the end of the runway and applied a full right rudder to attempt to divert the aircraft to the right. The left wing of the aircraft collided with the embankment, resulting in the destruction of the left landing gear and engine as it exited the runway at a speed of 72 knots. The fuel in the left wing ignited and initiated a fire on the left-hand side of the aircraft after it came to a stop. The cabin was filled with smoke at this juncture. However, the cabin crew was able to initiate an evacuation by opening the doors and releasing the slides, allowing the passengers to evacuate. Within 3 minutes, fire personnel arrived at the station to combat the fire, and the majority of the passengers and crew had successfully evacuated. We were able to flee the aircraft. However, the crash resulted in the immediate deaths of one of the pilots and one of the passengers. This resulted in 68 of the 70 crew and passengers surviving, with the majority sustaining injuries. They were all transported to institutions for examinations. So, what was the outcome of this incident? Therefore, the report's recommendations were that the aircraft operation manual should include specific modifications to account for the increased landing distance that is necessary when the speed is increased due to wind shear. There were suggestions made to Airbus regarding the potential implementation of emergency usage of ground spoilers and propulsion reservoirs that operated independently of the aircraft's existing criteria. As previously mentioned, the activation of both weight-on-wheel switches and/or 72 knots of rotation speed on both landing gear wheels. The thrust reserve was utilized to the utmost extent, which was 71% of the engine's capacity. The recommendation was that, in the event of an emergency, The reserve should be increased to facilitate the aircraft's immediate cessation. Additionally, the Polish civil aviation authorities were required to modify their system of accumulating and disseminating meteorological information to align with the ICAO convention. The embankment at the end of runway 11 at the Warsaw Aerodrome was also required to be described in the AEIP for Poland. Thank you all for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss out on our future content. Until next time, stay curious, stay creative, and keep exploring.